Hello, folks. Welcome to episode 5 of my Sanibel Chronicles. Again, I'm your host, Charles LeBuff. I plan this episode to continue with my story of my beginning of my career with alligators for that part of my life, and starting at the point when I arrived on Sanibel Island. The photograph that you're looking at is Point Bell. It's Sanibel's most eastern projection. It's where the Sanibel Lighthouse is located. And as I mentioned briefly in one of the earlier episodes, a requirement of my employment on what then was Sanibel National Wildlife Refuge was to live in one of those lighthouse quarters, and my family and I moved into the one that's closest to the water. Of course, those buildings are gone since Hurricane Ian in 2022. The aerial will be used later when I get on the subject of the lighthouse itself, because I'll point out some aspects of the photograph that are interesting. The next photograph is a photo of Tommy Wood. He was the first manager of Sanibel National Wildlife Refuge. And I worked with Tommy during my Red Tide lab work in Naples, and he invited me to take a position on the Sanibel Refuge. And Tommy was a pilot. He was very keen in Boy Scouting. You'll notice on the Jeep, Boy Scouts. And he would later insist that I take over the Boy Scout troop on Sanibel. That story will come later. This shows the headquarters sign for the refuge. It was located on the Gulf side of Point Bell, because back in 1958, when this photograph was taken, the road that led to the lighthouse came in along the Gulf Beach, and that's where this sign is located. The Sanibel Refuge was established in 1945, and 2 years later, in 1947, President Truman ordered a proclamation that all of the land mass within that refuge boundary would be closed to the hunting, taking of migratory birds. In 1949, when Tommy Wood entered on duty on Sanibel in April of 49, everything within that closure order was considered to be National Wildlife Refuge, irrespective of ownership, because of that closure order. Coleman in the Florida Keys for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service before taking the position on Sanibel. And he had a federal commission, law enforcement commission, and also a state commission as a deputy Florida game warden. This was something that the state and federal government did to give both the person with both commissions the ability to enforce state and federal wildlife laws. This next photograph is, I believe it was taken by my wife from the porch of Quarters 2 during the day that I entered on duty. That was January 5th, 1959. It's Tommy and myself on the porch of Quarters 1. That's where the refuge office was located. And back in those days, the refuge staffs throughout the nation were not uniformed. That would come a couple of years later. I had to undergo a 1-year probationary period being a new employee, but in 1960, I was granted my dual federal, and state commissions. These commissions, the federal commission gave us the authority to wear badges, of course, carry firearms, make arrests, and serve warrants. The state commission allowed us to protect wildlife through state wildlife rules, but it gave us neither a badge, a state badge, nor the right to carry a firearm. So our federal commissions gave us that ability. This next shot is me in 1960 at the Seaplane Canal in the Bailey Tract in my brand new uniform with my badge, and I'm holding a small alligator. This was taken by a professional photographer by the name of Treat Davidson, who at the time was doing a story for National Geographic on alligators. Now, a story that I should point out, when I entered on duty, Tommy Wood knew that I studied alligators through a tagging program, but he insisted that I not capture alligators during my official hours, but it was perfectly fine for me to conduct my studies after hours. So I agreed to that, and from that point on, I never obtained a state permit, because the refuge, all lands on Sanibel being considered a refuge, we regulated the studies and other aspects of wildlife management. So I had that order not to catch alligators, so I could live with that. He did assign me the task of compiling a herp list, the amphibians and reptiles that were found on Sanibel Island, and I did that from 1959 until 1990. And since I retired from the service, Chris Lekowitz of the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation is keeping that program ongoing. And believe me, with all the exotics that were introduced to the islands and landscape vegetation after the frequent hurricanes over the last decade, he's added quite a few species to that list. But the funny story that I wanted to say before I forget it was about 60 days after Tommy told me that I wasn't to catch alligators as part of my official duties, we went down to the Bailey Tract. He had borrowed a canoe, and we paddled in the Bailey Tract. It was flooded and fairly clear there back in those days. And the task he had given us, that he would paddle the canoe and I would sit in the bow of the canoe and catch alligators. He had promised the approaching Sanibel Shell Fair that he would provide an alligator to exhibit at the live shell exhibit that's always part of the shell fair. To add a little action to this episode, I'm going to slip in a movie clip that we made in the early 60s. It's me catching an alligator. There's a simple dash into the water, grabbing the alligator, getting a good grip on it, coming out of the water with it, holding it properly, and then applying a Manel metal tag to the alligator's tail. In 1961, I was elected president of the Sanibel Captiva Audubon Society, and the board knew of my interest in tagging alligators, so they purchased tagging applicators and a series of Manel metal tags for me to use in my program. And that was a very big jump in the equipment that I used to conduct my studies. This next photograph is a black and white aerial that was taken probably in the late 1960s, early 70s. As you look at it, if you're familiar with Sanibel, the clearing in the upper left-hand corner is the present site of the electric co-op's Sanibel Captiva electric substation. The story that I'm going to tell you now, that was not there at the time. In about 1964, my friend George Weymouth, who had taken my job at Everglades Wonder Gardens, left that position and came to Sanibel with his family. And during that time, the U.S. Bureau of Land Management was surveying land on Sanibel, trying to determine remnants of U.S. public domain lands because the refuge was planning to expand. And George was hired in that survey crew. And one evening he came to my house at the lighthouse. He was all excited, but they had just cleared a survey line on a quarter section that led through that pond. We call it, the refuge called it, West Government Pond. It was part of a 2,000-acre lease that the refuge had from the state. And I knew that pond. I was quite familiar with it because when Tommy and I were on aerial patrols, I'd always ask him to fly a few passes over that pond so I could count the large alligators in the pond. There were some tremendously large alligators there, several in the 12-foot length category. So once we had access to that pond, I wanted to go in there and try to tag some alligators that dwelled in this pond. It was surrounded by red mangroves, but it was not salt water. It would vary in the summertime from fresh water, and in the dry season it would get down to about 12,000 parts per thousand chloride. So it had a degree of salt in it. But during the years it didn't totally dry, it did have a population of brim that had, the brim or bluegills had been introduced by the Fish and Wildlife Service to Sanibel sometime, I believe it was the mid-60s, if my memory serves me correctly without actually looking up the record. So George and I, we enlisted one of our alligator helpers. His name was Hank Chastain. And I'm showing now a film clip. It's a little bit mixed up. This is our first trip. The first part, it's George Weymouth. He's carrying our catch pole for alligators. It's a 12-foot Calcutta pole with a line on it. And he's leading us down this rough cut survey line. And Hank and I are behind him pulling a 17-foot Grumman aluminum canoe. It took hours to pull this thing through the mangroves. And that white line that you see leaving Sanibel Captiva Road goes directly from the road and intersects with that survey line where it makes that sharp turn, and the survey line runs north into the pond. So we finally got that canoe into the pond, and that gave us a chance to get in there and search for alligators. You'll notice that George has like a necklace around his neck. Well, those are bird bands. If you look at the photo of Government Pond closely, you'll see there is a tiny, round-looking island-like configuration in the pond. Well, back when we first went in there, that was a tiny island. It was completely surrounded by water. And the day we went in there, I knew that there were anhingas nesting on that little island. I saw that from the air. So George had a federal banding permit. And of course, I did a lot of bird banding in my job back in those days. So we were intent on banding as many anhingas as we could. I don't remember us seeing any alligators that day, but we found at least a dozen enormous alligator caves. Alligator caves are dens that alligators physically dig, usually up under some suspending tree system. In this case, they were up underneath some large red mangroves. And some of those caves were 5, even 6 feet wide, where they had been used for decades by growing alligators. We ran our catch pole down inside them. We never touched an alligator or the end of the cave, of course. But we did band quite a few young birds. A few weeks later, George and I decided to go in there. The rainy season hadn't quite started, but the pond was still flooded. So about dusk, we arrived where we had the canoe tied up on the pond, and we waited. We had a tremendous odor coming from the pond. When the light breezes blew across the pond, we could smell the odor of decaying fish. And then as it grew darker, we could hear a lot of splashing to the, it's actually the western end of that pond, where the pond tapers and then widens again. We paddled down in there, and in about 2 hours, we had caught, measured, tagged, and released 35 alligators between 4 and 7 feet long. They either lived in that pond or they were drawn there because of the odor of the dying brim that were dying because the water had gone down so low, there was no dissolved oxygen. The water temperature was up over 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So that was in my career, the most alligators we ever tagged in one night. The next slide is a shot of an alligator approaching from the water. You can see the catch pole and the noose. We had been called by the caretaker of the old ferry boat, the Algiers, where Gulfside City Park is now, that he had found an alligator nest on the property. And as part of our study, we wanted to go examine it, count the eggs. So we went where he directed me to go to find the nest. And we opened the nest, counted the eggs, recorded all of that. And the alligator, the female, was hissing, staying in the water. And she'd charge a few feet up the bank, then withdraw. And we managed to catch her. In the next photograph is George with the alligator after it had been caught. Now this alligator is at a size that it's extremely quick, extremely dangerous, and this was the upper limit of the alligators we preferred to catch. Over the years, I did catch larger alligators, and I'll talk on some of that in the next episode as we get close to concluding the alligator events of my career. The next slide is where we would use a combination of Monell tags in the alligator's tail, but then we also developed a codified system to shorten the keels, the scutes, on the alligator's tail in a series that was recorded to avoid any duplication of scutes shortening. So I don't want to get this too long, so I think I'll conclude then. I want to thank those folks who have subscribed to my channel, and I appreciate the many thumbs up. That all counts, I guess, in the analytics of YouTube, and I appreciate those. I did have one question that I failed to mention at the kickoff. Someone emailed me using the email in the logo up in the top left-hand corner, and asked how I managed to meet the Seminole leader, Corey Osceola. Well, it so happened that when I started work at Everglades Wonder Gardens, I worked weekends in 53, 54. I became a permanent employee until I decided to move on to other positions elsewhere. But Corey was a frequent visitor of Bill and Lester Piper. They were friendly, so Corey would come by quite often, and I'd managed to hear some of the stories that they shared. So that's how I met Corey Osceola. And I mentioned how I met his daughter when she was waiting tables in the cafe at Payolita Station down in Collier County. I do want to mention one more thing. Sadly, this week, a few days ago, we had two crocodilian attacks here in Florida. The first one happened over on the East Coast, where a young guy fishing, the alligator grabbed him by the hand and removed his hand, and I understand part of his arm. A very, very sad situation. Sometimes people fish in areas where alligators occur, and they're really not aware that the motion of fish in water is attracted by sensory organs around the alligator's mouth, and they can pinpoint even underwater where that action's coming from, and they take off hell-bent for it. And that's probably what happened. Just a case of the alligator going after the natural attraction, and the young man's hand was removed in that action. A very sad situation. But then more recently, a fellow swimming in the boat basin down at Flamingo at Everglades National Park, he had capsized a small sailboat in the basin, and he was pulling it, apparently, is from what the news that I read said, pulling it back to the dock. And there are several crocodiles, American crocodiles, that live around that boat basin. And this one crocodile grabbed him by the leg, but released him. So he had a serious wound, but he wasn't disfigured. There have been dozens of alligator bites since the state started keeping records in 1945, and I'll talk about some of those in the next episode. But heretofore, since records have been kept, the crocodile bite at Flamingo was only the second bite that has been made public in Florida. The American crocodile is much more timid and wary of people than the American alligator is. So with that bad news, I'll leave you until next time. If you will, please subscribe. I'm trying to build my subscription numbers as high as I possibly can through these efforts. And please, if you just open this for a second and don't take time to get its full educational intent, please give it a thumbs up. Please like it, because that counts too. And it gives me the increase in likes and the increase in subscriptions, gives me a feeling of support that I need to keep spending my time talking about things that pertain to Sanibel Island, and the Sanibel Island content to make my wife happy will improve and increase as time goes on. Thank you much.